Matt Brothers. In this video, we'll demonstrate the construction and finish of a mission-style library table. We will go through the design, wood selection, wood preparation, joinery methods, assembly, and final finish of the product. As an added bonus, we will attempt to fume this product to try to replicate the original color. Mission style is, or craftsman style as it has been called, or from a brand standpoint, Stickley furniture, you may have heard of, is traditionally a simple, pleasing, straightforward design, simple lines, leaning more towards the heavier side for things like legs, tabletop thickness, things of that sort. Here is a view of the actual project that we'll be making. As you can see, it's a relatively small. It's 32 inches deep by 46 inches wide by about 30 inches tall. The top is 1 1/8 inch thick lumber. Each leg is a 3x3 piece of lumber, which we'll be using solid, by the way. Here is a view of the lumber that we'll be using for the top of the project. As you can see, it's quarter sawn, lots of rays and flakes. That's these larger areas that you see showing highlighted. I have put a little paint thinner on it, mineral spirits, to give you an idea of what it'll look like. Now that we have talked about design and wood selection, let's talk a little bit about wood preparation. We have to get each piece that we're working with square and flat on at least two sides prior to any further processes. I have already planed all of this lumber to get it dimensioned thickness-wise to what we were trying to get according to the plans. But now I've got to get each board straight. And in this case, I've used my little trusty straight edge jig here that I clamp the board into and run it against the fence here, this carrier, if you will, with the clamps built into it, which then gives it a straight edge on one side, which allows me to rip this edge of the board straight. We need to always try to keep guards in place on every cut possible. There are some that you have to remove them, but you need to be aware of when it's safe to and when it's not safe to, and keep them in place at all times. Now let's make a cut straightening this side of the board with our jig. Be running some equipment, maybe a little loud, so we won't talk during any cutting operation. Now we have a board that's flat on two sides, straight on one, still rough cut on the other and not straight. We need to now bring this side parallel to that side, and we'll do that after we join this edge, making sure it's nice and straight and cleaning it up on the joiner. Now here's our joiner, which we're going to take this board and square the face that we just cut, which is this one here, square it to these two faces. That will allow us to then take it back to the table saw and then parallel this other side. Now that we have this board square and cleaned up on three sides, we'll cut this side, again parallel to the side that we just joined. Now this board is now squared on all sides. We'll join that in that we just cut, and then it will be ready to glue up with the adjoining boards for the tabletop. Now that we have the boards for the top surfaced on all four sides, we're ready for layout of the top in regards to how the grain matches up, what we're looking for in the finished product, and looking for imperfections and things of that sort that we may want to put on the bottom as opposed to the top. So we go through and look at each side of the board to try to figure out what we're looking for, what side we want to present. In this case, we think that the customer will like the flakes and the rays as opposed to just a straight grain. So we're going to go for that to turn to the top. That one looks like that would be that way. This one pretty much either way, but we have some imperfections here, so we're going to turn that one over and go with that side as the top. This one has some nice flakes in it. This side not so much, so we'll go with this side for the top. This one, a straight grain there. Oh, there we are. There's the rays and flakes. But now that we have our board orientation settled upon and we know what we want as our face of the finished product, it's time to do the glue up of the entire panel. And so that you don't lose orientation as you're gluing up, it's nice to mark them so that you can put it back together again the way that it is as it sits. The easiest way to do that is just draw a V over the entire range of the board. That way, as you're gluing them up, you know exactly where each one will line up. In glue up, several options. Obviously, the simplest would be just to glue them as they sit. No joinery methods and the like. But we do have a little warpage on some of the boards. They're pretty flat, but there's a little, even though they are all the same thickness, there are some imperfections there. To help with alignment, particularly a top this big in its width, and as many boards as there are, it would probably benefit us to put biscuits in it. You certainly wouldn't want to put splines or anything, then you'd have that showing on the ends. So biscuits are our best option. Being that it's 1 1/8 inch thick, we'll go with the largest biscuits, which are the number 20s. And we'll put probably about a half a dozen, four to six in each board at each joint. Anywhere you want them, as long as they're the actual joints for each one line up, or you know where they're at, so they line up when you put the top together. Make sure you do not cut on the two end boards. You don't want to cut those faces and then have to deal with that later. Biscuit cutters, there's all kinds of designs. I found that this one works well for me, but we want to set it on the 20, because that's the size of biscuits that we're going to put into it. Plus, we want to center where we cut the biscuit in the board. For the biscuits are now all cut. They should all be aligned again as you continue that process through the rest of the top, and then we'll assemble it. Now that we have all the holes cut for the biscuits, we're ready for glue. Now, as large a panel as this is, and as many boards as we are gluing up, we won't try to glue it all at one time. Glue would start to dry on us at the time we move from each set of the board and put all the biscuits in. So what we're going to do is glue these two boards up and these two boards up in one setting, and then come back after they've dried and put the one in between. So we'll move that one off to the side and get these set up to glue together. And we'll use the same clamps to glue them all. We'll just bring this one over here and just glue it as one, but there won't be any glue in here, and then we'll take it back apart and move that other one in. So let's set up the glue. Stand up the board so that you can get to the two surfaces that you're wanting to put glue on. And we've got a nice little uniform bead of glue, just a little sneaking out on all the joints. You don't want to force it, all the glue out. You just want it nice and snug so you get a nice even joint from one end to the other. Now we'll put it aside for half a day or so. They say half hour is plenty, but I like to give it several hours. Then we'll come back and put our board in the middle. It's time to glue up the center section, and we'll do that now. The only difference here is you've got taller boards to have to deal with, and two different joints on the same board, but the same process. Just fill up our biscuit grooves with a little bit of glue. And there you have it. Now, nice thing to look at doing, there's a little glue squeeze out in the joints. It's much easier to clean that off after about a half hour to an hour of it drying, where it's still it's not hard, but a little tacky. It'll come right off. Some people like to wash it off with a wet rag. That can work. Tend to work a little of the glue into the surface. If you're not sanding very much, you might leave some of that glue in there. So I found it's best to just scrape it off, and then you do your finished sanding after that. So we'll let that sit and dry, and then come back. After the glue has dried on this tabletop, we've removed the clamps, and there will still be, though, some very slight raised areas where the edges of the boards were joined together. And those, prior to sanding, will need to be scraped down to try to minimize the amount of sanding that you have to do, and it'll more quickly remove the wood. What I found very useful is a scraper similar to this that has a carbide tip blade on it. It's very sharp, and it works very good to remove the material. Just drag it from down the seam on each one, and pull it skewed slightly at an angle so you get a little more of a shear cut. And you'll very quickly remove the high places on the boards. Now that we have finished the top and have it ready for final sanding, we'll proceed to the lower shelf. This was done identical to the top in that you've got that dry for a little while, and then we'll come back and lightly scrape the still soft glue off, and then let it dry. A good way of checking that you're getting a good even sanding is to run a pencil line, serpentine up and down the entire width of the board, so that when it comes out the far side and that all those lines are gone, you know you've got all the surfaces covered without looking very closely and trying to judge whether you've got even sanding throughout. So let's set that up and run that through now. The next step in our process of building this table is creating the side rails and lower stretchers for the table. What we have here, again, made just like the tabletop pieces, flat, squared on all edges, cleaned up, and cut to approximate length, a little over, so that we can clean them up when we do our final measurements to cut the tendons. But you have the two side rails, the front and back rail, and the lower stretchers. When we get the mortises cut in the legs, then we will attempt to lay out and cut the tendons on all 6 of these pieces. But you always start with your mortises and then fit your tendons to the mortise that you cut. And like the side rails, we also have to cut all of the slats that go in the side. There's 10 of those that connect the upper rails to the lower stretchers. And we'll do that out of 5/8 material, which we have here rough cut to length, and then we just need. One of the unseen key elements of this table is the tabletop fastener. the fasteners that we will actually use to fasten the table top to the aprons and legs of the table. Traditionally, this item here, a fastener, handmade fastener out of wood, would have been fashioned, which would, this end here fitting into a groove in the apron, this end here screwed to the tabletop, would have been used, and that is what we're going to use for this table. Other modern fasteners would be this little figure 8 here, and one similar to this that's made like that but is out of just a bent piece of flat stock. The post material has come in, and we have sized it by cleaning up two edges, two faces on the joiner, making sure they're nice and square, and then cutting them to our final 3 by 3 dimension, and then cleaning up the other two faces, cutting them to length, and then we're ready to set up for all of our joinery. Again, we're using a mortise and tendon joint, and to do that accurately, you need to set your posts up, orient the grain the way that you want it to show, and then lay your mortises out on the posts with pencils, in addition to labeling each post to its respective position with the final table, so that you don't get everything confused as you go and cut those mortises. So we've done that, and we've marked all of our joints where each one will be, here, here on these two posts. Same with the back posts, same with all 4 posts. Then we're ready to take it and cut all of our mortises for the tendons that will then also go on our upper cross rails and then the lower stretchers. Again, you want to set all of those up, orient the grain to where you get the face that you're looking for prior to laying out the tendons marks on them. So we've done all that. Now we're ready to start cutting all of our mortises, and we'll do that operation next. Our next process is cutting the mortises into the 4 legs. Do that. I've already set the legs to cut the 1/2 inch mortise, which is what we will use for the aprons around the top. It's a 7/8 inch board, so we'll use a 1/2 inch tendon on each of those pieces of apron. So we've got to cut a 1/2 inch mortise in the legs, each of which will be about 1.5 inches deep. That'll be the length of the tendon, but we'll actually go about another 1/8 of an inch deep to give us a little clearance for glue and make sure that we never bottom out with each of the tendons. So we'll go ahead and cut one of those 1/2 inch mortises out now and see how that comes out. Now that that's cut, remove the leg from the machine, clean out the mortise, prior to cutting the tendons on each of the aprons that go around the top or underneath the tabletop that hold the legs together, we need to cut the groove that the tabletop fastener will reside in and hold the tabletop to the frame of the table itself. So to do that, we do that on the table saw. We've already cut the first groove, spaced so that the tabletop fastener is short of fitting up flush against the top of the table, which will fit on this edge. We want to be able to have a little gap where this fits, the tabletop fastener fits a little lower than flush with the top, so that it'll always keep some tension holding the tabletop to that. So we've already cut the first groove. We're going to cut the second groove to make it actually fit the little tip on the fastener. groove on the inside where the pin or the tabletop fastener will fit and hold the top of the table onto the aprons around the underside of the table. Now that we have all the mortises cut, we're ready to cut the tendons on the ends of our aprons and the stretchers for the table. To do that, we need to first cut a shoulder on the end of each of the apron pieces. And to do that, we'll do that on the table saw with the blade set just high enough to give us our 1/2 inch thick tendon, which we use for the apron pieces, 5/8 of an inch for the stretchers. But we'll cut that shoulder on the table saw, and we'll do that process now. That gives us our 1.5 inch long tendon for each apron. We've defined that shoulder. It's 1.5 inches from here to here. We will then cut the remainder of that off with a jig, also on the table saw, after we've cut that shoulder on all 4, actually 6 pieces. After all the shoulders have been cut on the faces of the aprons, we need to cut the shoulder on the ends as well. So we need to raise our blade so that we end up cutting 3/4 of an inch off bottom and top of this board. Being that it stood up, I've added a clamp to steady it with the miter gauge as we run it through. So again, you use the same spacing as you did for the faces as you do for the ends. We'll cut that process now. And now you have all the shoulders cut all the way around, and all we have to do next is cut off the faces, and we'll do that with another jig, which we'll show you later. Using a tendoning jig works well, and that's what we'll use in this case. We'll do that part now. Next thing is you want to test fit, that it fits in the mortise. That's a good fit. The last step in creating the tendon is to cut this cheek off of each piece on each side. And the simplest way to do that is on the bandsaw. Now you can take a chisel and whack that off, or a hand saw. But I found it's easy just to mark the location of each cut and just cut it off on the bandsaw. You can always fine tune it later with a chisel if you need to. A little slop inside is not going to hurt. It allows you for some adjustment if you need to. So cutting it a little narrow is not really a problem. Just cut to the line and you'll have your finished tendon. Now that we have all the mortises and tendons cut, it's time to sand everything and get it ready for assembly. Before we start the actual sanding process, though, we want to relieve all the corners of our post with a very slight bevel, just enough to knock that edge off, give it a more of a hand finished look as opposed to just a small round over or just sanding the edge. So to do that, we'll use our small block plane and just take that edge off, about half a dozen strokes down it with a fairly shallow cut set, just enough to, again, relieve that edge. We'll end up sanding it somewhat, just sort of round over those sharper edges. But we just want to cut that edge off just with a 45-degree bevel, just to sort of clean it up. After we do that to all the posts and the bottom edges of the apron material, top and bottom of the stretchers, then we'll start assembly. Now that we have all the parts sanded and we're ready for final assembly, you want to lay out the section that you're going to assemble first the way it should be. Everything oriented in the direction that you want it, so that there's no confusion when you start putting glue on things, to make sure that you don't hold up that process. Make sure that it all goes together correctly. So anyway, we've got that laid out. Also, prior to gluing, it's essential that you dry fit everything. I've already assembled this several times to make sure everything fits, everything goes in its place, and I've disassembled it, of course, done the final sanding, and now we're ready for assembly. So have everything that you need, all your glue, your brushes, hammers, clamps, everything that you need to assemble. And then let's start that process. We'll start with putting the slats into the lower stretcher first. We want just a little glue in the bottom. It basically is just floating. It's not a structural member. It just needs a little glue to sort of keep it from moving, opening up at the bottom as opposed to the top. The top is made such that if it does open a little, that's fine. It won't be seen. But the bottom, you want it to stay in place over its life. So we want to put just a little glue on the insides of the mortises. You don't want to put any glue on the shoulder surfaces, or you're liable to get a squeeze out, which makes it very hard to clean up prior to putting the finish on. So just a little bit of glue in this case. Again, it's not structural, so we don't really want much in there, just enough to hold it in place over the years so it doesn't move. Just a very little. And we'll drive these all home. place while we assemble the ends. The next one, we'll put a good amount of glue in each mortise. Again, don't try not to get any glue on the shoulder surfaces. If you've made your mortise deep enough for the glue to relieve in there, it doesn't matter then about how much. If you put too much glue in here, it'll have a place to go. Rather have too much here than not enough, because we are going to put just a very little on our tenons. Otherwise, we'll get a squeeze out on our shoulders, and we don't want to have to spend a lot of time cleaning it up later. Get all the surfaces. Again, we're putting plenty of glue on all 4 surfaces. We need to put enough in there to keep it close to the top, because while we're putting glue on the other side, it'll tend to run to the bottom of the tendon, or the mortise that is. Now, get close. Take the shelf. Slide the tendons through. And slide these in as well. Make sure the tendons are centered. We left an 1/8 inch gap on either side of the tendon because this board will shrink and swell over time, so we've got to make sure that it has room to move. Again, there's no glue on this end because these pegs will hold it in place later. After the assembly has dried from putting the 2 ends together, the last thing we have to do on the frame of the table is to peg the through tendons on the lower shelf where they attach to the stretcher. To do that, we just take a piece of white oak, cut a small taper on it, and cut it to fit the hole. Now that we have the pegs in place, the frame for the table is complete. All we have left is to finish sanding and sizing the top. The last item to cut is to take the top, and to do that, cut it to width first on your table saw, then cut it to length by putting a straight edge on one end, measuring off from the end where you need to go to. We'll cut that in, flip it around, measure. Once that's complete on both ends, sand all surfaces, and then it'll be ready to attach, and we'll be completed and ready for finish. We have built this enclosure that we will put the table into, and then with that we'll put small pans of ammonia, concentrated 24% ammonia, and leave it for 12 to 24 hours depending upon how long it takes to reach the color that we're looking for. Now that we have the table inside and everything spaced so that we can get the ammonia around all surfaces, we'll actually put the ammonia in and then close up this end and seal it for the next 12 to 24 hours, and we'll come back and see what we have after that. With the table removed from the fume hood, after it's stayed in there long enough to get us to close to the color that we're looking for, it's time to put the finish on it. The finish that we're going to use will consist of a coat of Danish oil with a top coat of lacquer. We'll start on the bottom surfaces of everything first so that we can get a coat of Danish oil on it, and then after we take off all the dust, then we'll turn it over and put the Danish oil on the top surface, and if we have to do any touch-ups for scratches or things of that sort, we'll be able to do that then. When you finish applying the Danish oil to this surface, we'll let it dry for a few hours, then we'll come and flip both pieces over so that we can then do the other side. In this case, it would be the top surfaces after we again let it dry. A couple of precautions: make sure with any oil-based finishes that you use plenty of ventilation. Additionally, any of the rags that you use to wipe off the oil finish, you need to spread those out, let them dry, completely air out prior to throwing them away. The risk here is that the oil in those rags, if you do not let it completely dissipate, will create heat and potentially spontaneously combust. We're going to now spray the top. I've got the ventilation running since we're going to be putting out quite a bit more volume of lacquer. So we'll cover the top. We'll go side to side across the grain pattern first, and then with the grain secondly. Once we have the first coat of lacquer on it, we want to slightly sand it down. To do that, I use either triple or quadruple aught steel wool. I try to open up the steel wool and just sort of make a wad out of it. That way you can open it back up and change it around different surfaces to keep a good fresh surface to use with. I'm going to go over it to begin with the triple aught. And what you're doing is just trying to sort of, you'll feel it a little rough after your first spray. You're just trying to knock that down. Go against the grain to begin with. Just again, working it lightly to smooth it up. You'll see some scratch marks in the lacquer. Not a problem. The next coat of lacquer will smooth that right out. It'll just lay down nice and flat. But work the whole surface, cross the grain to begin with, and then finish up going with the grain. Now that we have a couple of good coats of lacquer on the tabletop, it feels really smooth, but it still could be a little smoother, a little flatter, better writing surface if we feel the little bit of grain that's there. The nice thing about quarter sawn is there's not much grain to fill. There's not a lot of voids like a regular flat sawn, rough sawn oak. That edge grain really fills quite well. It's not, there's again not a lot there. But anyway, we're going to sand it, wet sand it using little mineral spirits. We're going to start with some 220 and then work all the way up to about 400. To do that, we'll just flood a little surface with mineral spirits, sand that small surface, wipe it down, move to another surface, and then we'll do the whole top that way. Then we'll come back and do the same process with 400 grit, and then wipe it again off, mostly against the grain, trying to leave, basically what we're trying to do is create a slurry of lacquer that will then fill what little voids are there, and then let that sit, and then we'll spray, and hopefully that'll give us a good flat top, smooth finish. So here we go. Now that we have the finish on the table, all we have left is to assemble it, which is just basically screwing the top to the frame. We're going to do that with our homemade tabletop fasteners that we made earlier. And I'm going to space 3 on the long side and 2 on each of the ends. And we're going to, when we put them in there, put the end ones until they go all the way into the groove. There will be no real movement of the wood in this dimension, so keeping it nice and tight that way is not a problem. Side to side though, you want to leave about a 1/16 of an inch gap between where the end of the fastener touches the bottom of this little mortise in here, a dado that we've cut to put the fastener into. Now that we have the top fastened to the frame, all we have left to finish this project is putting on these little pads on each of the legs to protect the floor and protect the table. Do that for the other 3, and this project is complete.